She had once been applauded by crowds in top universities and later ignored at fancy dinners where all they saw was her apron. She used to be a respected expert, someone doctors listened to, and ended up reduced to just a nanny by people who had never read a single word she'd written. Elora Jameson had lost everything she held dearest, and when the pain became unbearable, she vanished from the world, trading the spotlight for a tiny back room in a mansion in Boston. No one knew where she came from. No one could guess the secret she was hiding, until the day the humiliation exploded in front of everyone, and what seemed like just another act of snobbery turned into a powerful lesson that would change the future of a wealthy family, and hers too. But what happened next, you'll have to see for yourself. Boston could be beautiful in October, with its copper-colored trees and the woody scent of dry leaves covering the sidewalks. But behind the charming facade of Cedar Lane, where the city's millionaires lived, there were stories you wouldn't find in any magazine. One of them started quietly at mansion number 1140, home to Clarice Waltham, a cold and calculating heiress of a chain of pediatric clinics. Her heels echoed on the marble floors like every step was an order. In that world of luxury, everyone had their place. And to her, Elora Jameson, the new nanny, was just another piece of furniture. From day one, Elora knew exactly how she would be treated. She heard things like, "You can use the back bathroom," or "The nanny doesn't eat at the table," and "That outfit's not appropriate for the social area." Clarice didn't always raise her voice, but she made it clear. Elora's presence was tolerated, never welcomed. Her eyes passed over her like she wasn't even there. No good morning, no good night. Just cold, impatient instructions. The mansion had 30 rooms, but Elora slept in a tiny space near the laundry room, where the air smelled like detergent and loneliness. 4-year-old Becca was a sensitive child, full of questions and hidden affection. She was the only one in that house who saw Elora as a real person from the start. Her drawings were always for Nanny Lolo. The hugs came without warning, and the night cries were all for her. Even when Elora fell asleep, exhausted on the porch chair, Becca would quietly cover her with a little pink blanket. That's what kept her going, because behind the soft smile and quiet voice, Elora was hiding more than just fatigue. She was carrying a secret, one that no one in that house could ever imagine. Clarice, unknowingly, kept mocking the wrong woman. When she'd say Elora wasn't educated, or that Nanny should be seen, not heard, she was stepping over something she didn't understand. Because Elora had once had another name. She had signed contracts, taught in lecture halls, and signed books for admirers. But all of that was lost on a rainy afternoon years ago, at an intersection that changed everything. Since that day, she chose silence. Not out of weakness, but survival. And like so many others, Clarice mistook silence for submission. During Sunday brunches, with relatives in suits and expensive champagne on the table, Elora moved quietly behind the chairs, picking up toys, practically invisible. The only voice she listened for was Becca's, mixed with tiny giggles and playful squeals. One day, Clarice's aunt said loudly, "These days, anyone can be a nanny. Back then, it used to be a calling." Elora swallowed hard. It wasn't the first humiliation disguised as a comment, and it wouldn't be the last. But she had learned not to react. At least not yet. Even the staff in the Waltham household, used to the family's cold standards, treated Elora with a certain dismissiveness. "Why are you still here?" the cook asked one evening. "You're too kind for this place." Elora just smiled, that kind of sad smile from someone who knows something others don't. Because there was a reason she had chosen that house specifically. A reason that had everything to do with Becca. And something else, something only she could feel, something she still didn't know how to put into words. Elora's clothes were always simple. Cotton pants, neutral cardigans, flat shoes. A sharp contrast to Clarice's designer dresses. It wasn't unusual to hear stifled laughs from guests whenever Elora showed up with Becca in her arms, especially during the rare outings in public. "Is that a nanny or a nun?" a neighbor once mocked. Elora pretended not to hear, but each of those little comments was like an invisible pin pricking her spirit. Still, she stayed quiet and kept going, because the secret she held inside wouldn't let her quit. Some nights, alone in her tiny room, Elora would open a wooden box and pull out an old diploma. Master's in Child Psychology, Columbia University. Next to it, a worn-out copy of a book with her name on the cover. A book once praised by educators all over the country. She'd run her fingers across the cover like she was gently touching a past that no longer felt like hers. It wasn't about clinging to old glory. It was a quiet way of reminding herself who she had been, and maybe, just maybe, who she could still become. But not yet. Not now. Clarice was the type who thought she was sophisticated, but confused arrogance with elegance. One afternoon, seeing Elora playing with Becca in the living room, she muttered to her sister, "She's actually kind of sweet, shame, she's just a nanny." The comment was followed by soft giggles. Elora heard it, pretended she didn't, but something inside her shifted. A new feeling, subtle but powerful, began to grow. It wasn't anger. It was the early spark of a deeper awakening, a moment that was coming sooner than anyone expected. Becca, young as she was, seemed to notice things the adults didn't. In one of her childlike drawings, she wrote in crooked letters, "The nanny is an angel who lives with me." When she showed it to Clarice, her mother gave a half-smile and said, "One day you'll have real teachers." Elora kept that drawing like a sacred keepsake. That night, she fell asleep with it next to her pillow, because even in the middle of humiliation, there were still gestures that could heal. And that colorful little paper said more about her than any framed degree on a wall ever could. It wasn't until the invitation to a fancy party arrived that fate, in all its mischievous timing, gave its first nudge. Clarice was determined to impress her investors. The mansion would host a glamorous event, full of important faces. Elora was told to stay away from the ballroom. "You're just the nanny. No one needs to see you," Clarice warned, without realizing she'd just lit the match that would ignite the very image she was trying to protect. And it was in that moment, between polished silver trays and rehearsed smiles, that everything truly began to change. The Waltham mansion had never looked more extravagant. Crystal chandeliers sparkled on the glasses, waiters moved like shadows, and the orchids on the tables had been flown in from Columbia that very morning. Clarice was in her element. Flawless makeup, tailored dress, and a speech crafted to charm the very people funding her expansion. It was the perfect night, until one detail, to her utterly unacceptable, threatened to shatter her illusion of control. Elora Jameson, with Becca in her arms, quietly entered the ballroom. The whole scene lasted just a few seconds, but for Clarice, it felt like an eternity. Elora wore a simple dress, light fabric, her hair tied back in a messy bun, and carried a calm expression that, somehow, made her presence even more uncomfortable. She had only stepped into the room to bring Becca to her mother, who had asked not to be disturbed. But as usual, Becca didn't want to leave her nanny's arms. That's when Clarice's eyes landed on the scene, and in a burst of rage, disguised as composure, she took 3 quick steps forward, raised her voice, and, in front of everyone, snapped, "You're just a nanny. Stay away from the guests." The ballroom went silent, like the whole room had stopped breathing. Glasses froze midair, conversations died out, and some guests glanced nervously toward the buffet table, unsure of what to do. Elora froze. Inside, something broke, but on the outside, she didn't let her body flinch. Becca clung to her neck, startled by her mother's tone. Clarice's eyes burned with anger. She expected, as always, that Elora would lower her head, apologize, and quietly walk away. But this wasn't an ordinary day, and this wasn't the same Elora she thought she knew. "Excuse me, Mrs. Waltham," Elora began, her voice calm but heavy with emotion. "I didn't realize that handing your daughter to you in person had become a social offense. She was asking for you." Guests glanced at each other. Clarice pressed her lips together, clearly frustrated at not having the final word. "If you want to know who I am, maybe next time ask before yelling in public." The words dropped into the room like a stone in still water. Now, everyone was looking at her, not as the nanny, but as someone who deserved to be heard. And Clarice, She was about to hear more than she ever expected. Becca, eyes full of tears, wrapped her arms around Elora's neck and whispered, "Don't let her yell at you." That innocent little "please" softened half the hearts in the room, including that of an elderly gentleman in a light gray suit, watching everything from afar with quiet intensity. His name was Norman Blake, one of the top donors to Clarice's pediatric hospital and former dean of the very university where Elora used to teach. When their eyes met, Elora hesitated. But it was too late to turn back now, and she knew some truths just need to be spoken. "Ladies and gentlemen," she continued, not shouting, but with the steady voice of someone who finally had something worth saying. "I know that to many of you, I'm just an employee, a nanny, as it was said. But what no one here knows is that before I came into this house, I taught at Columbia. I've stood on bigger stages, written about child development, been invited to speak at universities around the world. But life has its own plans." The room stayed silent. Some looked down, ashamed. Others were genuinely stunned. Clarice? She couldn't even hide her discomfort anymore. Elora went on, now with softer eyes, not seeking revenge, but understanding. "I lost my daughter and my husband in one single moment. And when it was all over, the only thing left was silence. I didn't become a nanny because I had no other choice. I chose to start over in quiet because the noise of the world was too much to bear. Becca, she was the first child who made me smile again." She paused, took a breath, looked down at the little girl still in her arms. "She brought me back to life, and no humiliation can ever erase that." A quiet clap came from the back of the room, then another, and within seconds, the entire ballroom was applauding. Some out of empathy, others out of relief, many out of shame. Clarice stood frozen, like someone who had just been stripped of all her masks, unsure if she should run from the embarrassment or from herself. Becca slipped down from Elora's arms, reached for her mother's hand, and pulled her gently. Clarice knelt down, and for the first time, heard her daughter say, "Elora is the best person I know." Clarice tried to regain control of the situation. She thanked the guests, forced a smile, and said it had all been a misunderstanding. But the truth was too loud to ignore. Elora was no longer invisible, and what Clarice called a scandal, others began to see as a powerful lesson. One she would have to learn, even if late, even if the hard way. The room didn't go back to what it was, because what had been seen and heard there could no longer be undone. And at the center of it all, Elora, with her heart pounding, was taking her first step out of the shadows. That evening didn't end the way Clarice had planned, but it ended exactly the way fate intended, because without realizing it, she just opened the door to something much bigger than herself. Bigger even than the image she worked so hard to protect. A door that, in the coming days, would throw open not just a hidden past, but a future no one could have seen coming. The video from the party spread like wildfire. By the next morning, it was everywhere, in group chats, Boston blogs, even educational forums. The nanny who silenced the elite. The secret no one saw coming. A public lesson in humanity. The headlines varied, but the message was clear. Elora Jameson was no longer just a nameless face in the background. People wanted to know more. Who was she? Where did she come from? What had led someone so brilliant, as they now described her, to accept such a modest life? The answers weren't in resumes. They were in the pain she had carried for years. Very few people, and no one at that party, could have guessed that Elora had once been a tenured professor of child psychology at the prestigious Columbia University. For nearly a decade, her research on trauma and cognitive development in children had been highlighted at international conferences. Fluent in 3 languages, Elora had been invited to speak across Europe, Latin America, and even at presidential foundations. Her book, The Words Children Don't Say, had won the National Child Development Honor Award. But despite all of that, tragedy doesn't ask for credentials. The accident happened on an ordinary afternoon. Heavy rain. Her husband was driving carefully. Their little girl, Hannah, was asleep in the back seat. A truck ran a red light. The crash was brutal. Elora survived. But when she woke up in the hospital, she learned she had lost them both. In a matter of seconds, her entire world collapsed. The days that followed were filled with such unbearable silence that even her own heartbeat felt too loud. And in that deep, suffocating darkness, she made a decision. She would never step into a classroom again. She would stop writing. She didn't want applause. She wanted to disappear. For months, she lived in isolation, sold her apartment, donated her books, vanished from social media, cut off contact with friends and colleagues. It was as if she had exiled herself from her own story. And when she finally felt the faint urge to live again, or at least try, she chose Boston at random. And there, flipping through newspaper ads and handwritten flyers on cafe bulletin boards, she saw the name Clarice Waltham. The job was for a nanny, a 4-year-old girl. And for reasons she couldn't explain, something about that ad stirred something deep inside her. As if, somehow, it was a chance to reconnect with the love she'd lost. Elora didn't want pity. She didn't want sympathy. When she filled out the application for the job, she left out all her academic titles. She preferred to be seen as a simple woman, not out of pride, but out of necessity. If she told them who she really was, she'd be ripping open a wound that hadn't healed yet. All she wanted, all she needed, was to care for a child, quietly, anonymously, with no spotlight. The pay was modest, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the bond she might be able to build, something that couldn't be measured in dollars, only in affection. And that's exactly what she found in Becca. But living with a secret takes strength. Clarice didn't know. The guests didn't know. Neither did the staff. But every day, when Elora looked at herself in the mirror of her tiny room, she would whisper, "You're still here." That was her mantra, her daily reminder that, despite the humiliation, the judgment, and the grief, she was still standing. When Becca smiled, something inside her healed. When Becca called her Lolo, the world felt a little less cruel. And maybe that tiny flame, that little connection, was what stopped her from giving up. When Elora told her story that night, she wasn't looking for redemption. She was looking for understanding. It was time to stop hiding, to turn grief into something that could shine. And what surprised the crowd the most wasn't the degrees or the awards. It was how she spoke about her pain. Gently, but without sugarcoating it. Pain doesn't make us monsters. It makes us more human if we know what to do with it. That line stuck in many minds that night, including Clarice's, who was only beginning to grasp the depth of the injustice she had caused. A few days later, the press uncovered her full identity. And with that came invitations, messages of support, even interview requests. A TV producer called, offering her a documentary deal. But Elora said no. It still wasn't the right time. She was rebuilding her life, and she needed to do it on her terms. She kept going to the Waltham house, caring for Becca as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The way people treated her, the way they looked at her, even the way Clarice spoke to her. And that shift, even if subtle, was the beginning of something much bigger. Clarice, clearly uncomfortable, avoided long conversations. But one day, she stopped in the garden as Elora read a book to Becca. She took a deep breath and said, "I didn't know. I'm sorry." Elora simply nodded. No need for more words, because what was coming next was bigger than an apology. It would be the start of a new bridge, a new kind of relationship, and maybe, just maybe, a chance for Elora to return to who she had always been, without hiding. But the world outside was already moving. And while Elora thought she could stay under the radar a little longer, one phone call would change everything. On the other end of the line was a well-known editor with a proposal she never expected to hear again. The call came on a Wednesday morning. The number was from New York, and Elora almost didn't pick up. She figured it was another automated message or credit card offer. But when she heard the excited voice say, "Dr. Elora Jameson, this is Maureen Delacroix, editor-in-chief at Atlantic Press," her heart raced like she was suddenly running a marathon. "We saw your video, and we need to talk." Elora paused. It had been years since someone addressed her so formally. But the editor didn't give her time to say no. She scheduled a video meeting and promised confidentiality. Elora took a deep breath. Maybe, just maybe it was time. Meanwhile, social media was on fire. A clip of her speech at the party had gone viral on TikTok. Pain doesn't make us monsters. It makes us more human. The phrase was already showing up on t-shirts, motivational posts, even painted on school murals. Thousands of comments flooded the original poster's profile. "This woman speaks for me. My mom was a nanny. She cried watching this. Clarice Waltham should be ashamed." The reactions multiplied, and with them, the curiosity. Who was Elora Jameson, and why had no one heard of her before? During the meeting with the editor, Elora was honest. "I'm not looking for glamour. I'm not ready for headlines." Maureen smiled and replied, "Your story doesn't need sparkle. It shines all on its own." Then came the proposal to re-release her old book with a new foreword, telling what had happened since the last chapter. A reunion with her own voice. A symbol of survival. Elora cried, not from vanity, but from fear, because writing again felt like ripping open her chest. But it also felt like breathing again after years of suffocating in silence. The news of the re-release spread quickly among educators and healthcare professionals. The words "children don't say" returned to the bestseller lists. She began receiving invitations to conferences. Universities reached out. A well-known TV show about real-life stories kept insisting on featuring her. And even while she tried to keep her routine with Becca, Elora could no longer live in anonymity. People in the streets of Boston began to recognize her, and the way they approached her, with respect, gratitude, and kindness, was both beautiful and terrifying. Clarice, seeing the media frenzy, grew tense. For the first time, she understood that her act of humiliation could have destroyed a woman already carrying immense pain. She found Elora in the home library and, with no fancy words, said, "You deserve more than I can give. But what if we tried again? In a different way?" Elora frowned, confused. Clarice continued with an offer. "Come back. But not as a nanny. I want you to be the new educational consultant for our network of clinics. I need someone who truly understands what real care looks like." Elora felt the ground shift beneath her. The next few days were full of reflection. Elora watched Becca playing with dolls on the rug and asked herself if she was ready. Ready to lead again. Ready to be heard again. Ready to turn pain into purpose. What Clarice offered wasn't just a job. It was a chance to heal the past with meaning. And even though a part of her still held some hurt, Elora recognized the sincerity in Clarice's gesture. Accepting the offer would be a fresh start and a challenge. But more than anything, it would be her way of finally stepping out from the shadows. The new role was announced quietly, but the internet had no chill, from nanny to education leader. The woman who taught empathy to the elite. The media followed every move, but Elora stayed grounded. She arrived early at the clinic every morning, listened to parents, comforted children, meetings, reports, shelter visits, training sessions, and above all, a new perspective on nannies, caregivers, the women who dedicate their lives to invisible work. "Dr. Jameson, can I take a picture with you?" asked emotional mothers. And she smiled, never showy, because deep down, she was still that woman, the one who used to cry in the little room at the back of the house. Becca now walked through the clinic with pride. She'd point to her mom and say, "That's Lolo, but now she's important." Elora would laugh, squeezing the little girl in her arms. "I've always been important to you, haven't I?" Becca would nod enthusiastically. And it was in that simple gesture, in that real, unbreakable bond, that Elora found the strength to keep going. Because for her, what mattered most wasn't the job title, the recognition, or the spotlight. It was the quiet truth that no one should be defined by what they do, but by how they touch the lives of others. In the once cold, sterile hallways of the clinic, where decisions used to be made strictly by spreadsheets, there were now spaces for listening, welcoming, and empathy. Elora launched emotional support programs for single mothers, reading circles for vulnerable children, and an internal policy that celebrated the value of invisible workers. Clarice watched it all from a respectful distance, a little in awe, a little unsure of how to process the change she had accidentally triggered. But she understood one thing. This was the moment to stay silent and let Elora shine. Slowly, Elora reclaimed the space that had always been hers. Not because of title, not because of status, but because she earned it, with soul. And while everyone celebrated her return, she held something close to her chest, an idea, a seed quietly growing inside her, a project that carried her name and had the power to transform the lives of other women like her. But that wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. Elora now walked the corridors of the new children's clinic with the same grace she once carried through the halls of the Waltham mansion. But this time, something had changed. The eyes that used to overlook her now followed her with admiration. Mothers greeted her with respect, fathers asked for advice, and the nannies, the same ones so often treated as invisible, looked at her with pride in their eyes. "You represent us," one of them whispered after a talk, voice trembling. And for the first time, Elora didn't look away. She smiled, with gratitude, with dignity. Her new routine was intense. Mornings started early with planning sessions. Afternoons were filled with reading workshops, meetings with educators, and, most importantly, with the caregivers. Elora launched a program called Circle of Trust, dedicated entirely to nannies, grandmothers, and caretakers. A space where they were seen, heard, respected. "You're not just taking care of children," she told them. "You're caring for the future, and no one will call that nothing ever again." Each meeting was another small victory against the structural humiliation so many carried in silence. Clarice had changed too, though in smaller, quieter ways. She walked more slowly now. She paid more attention. She started learning the names of the women who worked for her. She asked how they were doing. One day, over coffee in the clinic's garden, she said quietly, "You changed more than just my clinic, Elora. You changed my character." Elora listened, took a breath, and didn't say a word. Because sometimes true justice doesn't come dressed as revenge. It comes softly as quiet transformation. And that, without a doubt, was the best way to begin again. Elora's book was re-released with a heartfelt new foreword about loss, starting over, and faith. It quickly became required reading in education and psychology courses. One of the most quoted chapters featured the line, "It's not the job that defines who we are. It's the way we touch other people's lives that makes us great." That phrase became a motto. It appeared on posters in public schools, in viral social media posts, even in graduation speeches. But what few knew was that Elora had written it on a napkin in silence, on her very first night in the tiny room behind the Waltham's house. Becca grew up happy, surrounded by truth, love, and meaning. "Mommy," she once asked, holding an old photo, "was Lolo ever sad?" Clarice lowered her eyes and said, "Yes, honey." But she rebuilt herself, and she taught so many others how to do the same. That little girl, once raised by rules and staff, was now raised with care and empathy. Because Elora didn't just change her job, she changed a culture. And her greatest legacy wasn't in headlines, but in small gestures, invisible to most, but enormous to those who feel. Elora later founded a nonprofit called the Human Worth Project, focused on emotional and professional development for women in vulnerable situations. The project offered free training, psychological support, and partnerships with daycare centers and schools. Its goal was clear: to make sure no woman ever had to stay silent the way Elora once did. The first group of graduates received a handwritten letter signed by her. In it, she wrote, "You're not just anything. You are everything you haven't yet learned to see in yourself." At a packed auditorium during a national conference on emotional health in childhood, Elora walked onto the stage and spotted familiar faces in the audience: Maureen, Clarice, Becca, Norman Blake. She took the microphone and, before saying a word, paused to look around with quiet calm. Her heart pounded, but it wasn't fear, it was gratitude. "The world kept me quiet for a long time. But today, I speak for myself, and for all those still hiding." Applause, tears, recognition. She no longer asked for permission to exist. She stood tall, with purpose, with light, with truth. After the event, a young woman approached her in tears. "I'm a cleaner, and I never thought someone like me could dream. You made me dream again." Elora took her hands, looked into her eyes, and said, "Don't stop dreaming. Sometimes the strongest dreams are born in silence." And in that embrace, between two women marked by life, something bigger happened. An invisible chain of faith, of resilience, of emotional justice began to form, and it spread like a breeze reaching those who needed it most. This story, though it feels complete, still beats with life. Because real life doesn't end with closing credits. Every day, somewhere, someone is being judged by how they look, without anyone knowing the universe they carry inside. Elora Jameson never chased fame, applause, or forgiveness. She searched for purpose, and she found it. But perhaps the most beautiful part of it all is that sometimes one simple sentence can change the course of an entire life. If this story touched your heart, like this video right now, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?